Hello and welcome to the Cattle Show. My name is Mike Jared with Cargill Animal Nutrition. On today's show, I'm pretty excited. We're going to talk about a topic that is actually very important to the dairy industry today, and that is dealing with distillers. Distillers is a byproduct of the corn ethanol industry, and right now the big impact that we're seeing on the dairy side is really twofold. One is that we're going to have a lot of distillers available to us as ethanol continues to grow. But the other aspect that's very, very important for us right now is the impact that the ethanol industry is having on corn price. With corn price going up to levels that we haven't seen in 10 years or more right now. And it's really being created by a large demand for corn going through the biofuels industry, exports, and all the other utilization that we have for corn in the marketplace. We're going to focus on about three key aspects of that today. One is going to be nutrient availability. A second one is going to be nutrient consistency, and third is nutrient impact. And that nutrient impact is really looking at the effect of distillers on diets for the dairies. As we get into the show today, we're going to be joined by a couple of different people. First of all is Merrill May. Merrill is a business development manager in Amarillo, and he's going to be helping us to walk through some of the different aspects of distillers production and utilization in diets. And then second is going to be Larry Holly, who is very much so an expert understanding the various different plants, the way that ethanol is produced, along with the distillers as a byproduct of that. Very nice to have you on the show today, Merrill. Can you give us just a little bit of your background and some of the involvement that you've seen with distillers in the industry?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Mike, I'm in the Amarillo market. I'm going to be working with the dairymen in that market of the United States. Distillers is not a new ingredient to the dairy industry. We've had it around for quite a few years, and we've been working with it. What's new about distillers is the amount of distillers that's coming into the market. That's quite a big change from where we've been in the last decade, and that's going to be the thing that we're going to be struggling with in the future moving forward.
That's a great point, Merrill, because that is something that's very true. We have used distillers for many, many years. It's not a new ingredient to us. But on the other hand, we haven't been challenged with trying to get rid of this large amount of distillers that's going to be coming at us over the next 4 or 5 years, especially as more ethanol plants are built. So it is very important that we do figure out how to best utilize this in diets. And we're going to be challenged to actually use as much of it as possible in many diets, especially from the cost side, as we start dealing with high price of different grains, potentially as they get used for other things, and the byproducts that are coming off of that are available in the marketplace. As we start talking about some of this, really let's take a step back and talk just a little bit more about the industry itself that we're talking about, with distillers being a portion of that. And really that's the whole biofuel industry. So part of that is ethanol production. The other part is biodiesel. We're going to focus much more on the ethanol production side here today. But out of those two, we start with the ethanol production. It's going to be usually based on corn, but can really be any high starch source, so small grains could be included in that as well. As we do get that fermentation going on and we get the ethanol produced, off of that process we're going to start getting byproducts, and distillers is the main byproduct of that. One other aspect though, as we talk about the different types of distillers as well, is just the difference in whether that product is dried down or not. Because distillers is going to come from the ethanol production process as a wet product. And then from there, it can either be sold wet or it can be sold dry. Maybe you can comment just real quickly on the difference between the two and where you may see wet distillers versus dry distillers being used.
Yeah, a lot of that's just based on location to the plant. Obviously, it's expensive to transport product, and if you have water in it, it's going to cost you more to transport the same amount of dry matter of that product than if you don't have water in the products. So dairies or animal units are using wet distillers are probably going to be located closer to the plants themselves. And once you get farther away from the plant, they're going to be more prone to dry that product down so they can put it on a rail car, put it on a truck and transport it a longer distance and do it more economically.
Another aspect that is kind of interesting is just to look at what kind of an impact things like ethanol can have on our total use of fuels for the road. I mean, that's the primary use, is going to be blended with gas for fueling our cars. And when we look at that, if we actually took all of the production of corn that we had today and converted that into ethanol, it would really amount to less than 20% of the total gasoline usage that we have in the USA today. So it's a situation where certainly we're helping reduce our dependence on foreign oil and other things, but it is something that we're not going to replace 100% of that, certainly in the future, with this product.
That's what I understand, is that only a portion of the needs of the U.S. can be met through ethanol production.
You know, Merrill, on some of these topics, I've had a chance to kind of catch up with Larry Holly in Minneapolis. So let's go ahead and kind of check out what Larry had to say. Can you walk us through kind of what happens to a bushel of corn as it would enter one of those plants?
Sure, into a dry grind facility, the bushel of corn is taken in, and what you want is you want to start out with as clean a bushel as possible. So it goes through aeration and shakers to clean up the corn as well as possible. Then it's basically ground, and through the steam, or through the stream rather, it's put into the process. It goes into what they call liquefaction, and from there to fermentation. And then you have your ethyl alcohol that's extracted at that point.
With the process, can you give us a little more of an idea of the amount of product that will be generated? So we put a bushel of corn in, we're going to clean it, it'll go through the fermentation process. What's going to be the output?
Okay, a 56-pound bushel of corn, a number 2 corn, will yield basically 17 pounds of ethanol, 17 pounds of distiller's grains, and 17 pounds of CO2 gas. In most operations, of course, your efficiencies are based on utilizing or maximizing the amount of ethanol that you can extract. You want to keep your extraction rates high. And also your distiller's grains, you want to make sure that you're producing a quality product there.
One of our challenges is making sure that, especially as corn gets utilized more and more for ethanol, is really finding enough starch in some of our diets. We may be going from a situation where it's been easy to feed a lot of starch because it's been an inexpensive part of the diet, to a challenge in the future where starch may become very limiting in some diets just because it will be difficult to find high enough amounts of it out there.
Correct. There are a lot of experts that are examining that question today as to what will happen to starch and how will you compensate for it. I'm not sure. There's a good possibility you might see a lot more corn silage being fed for a starch component if grains can't be purchased effectively or in a dependable manner in a grain deficit area.
The challenge today is there's already a lot of variation within distillers, and as more of these processes come online, it's just going to increase that variation just because of new processes that we're using, things that will extract some of the fat, use that for other things outside of a dairy byproduct feeding or an ingredient feeding like that. It really is going to change the product, and it's going to be extremely important for the buyer to understand what they're dealing with.
Knowing your product is very important because you don't want to give away nutrition to the animal. You want to maximize it as best you can and exact maximum performance from the animal. So I think making sure that the nutritionist is well informed and knowing the product that's going to be delivered to your farm or dairy is very important in making sure that the ration gets balanced to the animal.
It becomes very important to work with the Cargill Animal Nutrition Consultant to really understand what's needed in a specific diet and maybe even go out and target specific types of distillers and nutrient profiles that fit best, along with the other on-farm ingredients, the forages, and all the rest of the elements that are needed. That way it works great for the producer to be able to identify some very highly valuable ingredients and maybe something that's tailored a little bit better for their operation than others just because of the on-farm situation that they have.
Yes, it's very important for the Cargill Animal Nutrition professional to be there. I think that they can identify some nice things for a particular dairy for feeding and help avoid some catastrophes that could lie ahead if they're not paying attention or if someone is not paying attention to how a particular commodity is being fed to the animal.
One thing that we kind of talk about with that is just the fact that cows crave consistency. It's one of the phrases, I guess, that we use a little bit because cows are really a creature of habit. So if we get into a situation where we can make things very, very consistent for cows, it's good. Whether that's in management, the way that they're handled, the timing of things during the day. Consistency is a great thing for the dairy cow. And along with that consistency is just the fact that cows require nutrients. They don't require specific ingredients. There is no requirement for soybean meal or corn specifically in the diet of a cow. What they require are the starch and the protein that would come from the corn, the protein and the amino acids that come from the soybean meal or other ingredients that we use. That's really what the cow is requiring.
And that's one of the things we focused on real hard within Cargill, is to make sure that we understand the nutrient availability of all of the ingredients that we bring into our mills, and that as we put diets together, we balance those diets, as most nutritionists do, we balance those diets on nutritional profiles, and we work very hard at delivering a consistent nutrient profile to those cows.
That's really the key bottom line, is if we can be consistent in all those other things, we also have to deliver a very consistent set of nutrients day in and day out. That's how we become very effective with production. The cattle are seeing the same nutrients every day, and it makes them more efficient, more productive animals in the end. This whole area of nutrient consistency is really an important one to the diet. One of the tools that we've really created over about the last 10, 12 years is something that we call the OVS database, or the Optimum Value Supplier database. And really that's looking at all of the different suppliers, so we can look at each individual supplier of any commodity, different commodities, and really understand what some of that variation may be. Can you talk to us just a little bit about how that can impact nutrient consistency within diets?
Well, I think the important thing, as you mentioned, Mike, is what it allows us to do is it allows us to look at various suppliers and look at the products that they're selling us that come into our mills. And by doing so, we're able to look at what the nutrient composition is of those products. And as we put our feeds together, we're able to make those more consistent to the nutrient profile that we expect that diet to be. That's the way we're using that. And as you mentioned, cows crave consistency. We have to have a very similar nutrient profile all the time. And the OVS database allows us to understand what the nutrient composition of not just distillers, but all the various ingredients that come into our plant.
As we start looking at the different plants out there, do you have any ideas of where some of this variation may be coming from as something like Distillers is produced?
It could be based on the drying process. That's probably a lot of it. It's based on the product they're starting with. All the plants are different in the way that they ferment the products and they manufacture the products. There isn't one single way that you make ethanol within the United States. So within the different companies that are involved, they all have their own little trade secrets in the way they do it. So they create product, they dry product. At different times there's various demands. As you start up a plant, that product is going to be different than if you've been running that plant for a longer period of time. So there's a lot of different sources of variation within a given plant.
One of the challenges that obviously we have when we start talking about any of these different ingredients is just what we use for a decision-making process on which plant location or which source we're going to buy. Many times in the industry, people look at just cost per ton. Which one is the lowest cost per ton source of this particular ingredient that we're looking for? But that's not always the best route to go when we start evaluating, especially with all this different nutrient content variation and things like that. Could you comment real quickly on some of the things that we may look for, at least in our purchasing, that help us make the best decision?
Well, I think, Mike, if you look at from a feed company standpoint, when we purchase Distillers, we want a consistent product, because if we're trying to develop a consistent nutrient profile in the feeds that we make of our plants, if the product is changing all the time, we're not going to be able to meet those minimum specifications. So we're looking for suppliers that can develop or can provide a specific product to us on a consistent basis. If you're a dairy producer, you probably, if you're buying through a feed company, you're relying on their quality control process to monitor that nutrient profile to distillers they buy. If you're buying Distillers as a commodity and putting it in a bay, for example, you need to focus real hard on where you're buying that Distillers, and that's consistent, because if you are just buying on price, it may come from one plant one day and a week later come from a different plant and then a different plant. And as you're seeing that change from plant to plant to plant, you're going to be buying a different nutritional profile each time. And it may not be the cheapest price that gives you that profile you're looking for.
As we do start dealing with some of that variation that we've talked about, we haven't talked a lot about just how wide of a range that can be. So for example, things like crude protein content of Distillers can range anywhere from 23, 24% on up to maybe 31 or 32% with typical Distillers. And then there are some others out there that may even raise that crude protein content quite a bit above that. Fat content can range from 7 to 12 or 13% in fat content. And obviously with those big of ranges, it will have a direct impact on what nutrients are delivered to the cow and an impact on their performance.
And you mentioned higher protein Distillers. I've heard numbers even up into the 50s or 60s for Distillers for some of the technology that isn't out today, but is on the road and is coming down the road, that's going to be a big change.
One aspect that at least we have, I guess, an advantage on is looking at some of that different nutrient profile of the different sources and really being able to purchase ingredients based on that. So for example, if we know one supplier consistently delivers an additional 2 to 3% protein or a little higher level of fat for energy, we'll very likely look at that supplier as one that we want to purchase from. And at that point, it really does mean that the cost per ton is a little bit less important. What's more important is the value that we get of the nutrients that we can deliver to the cows from that particular ingredient.
Like I mentioned earlier, if you're buying commodity or treating distillers as commodity, usually you associate that with you're looking for the best price. But depending on the plant you're buying from, depending on the source you're buying from, that best price may not be the best price from a nutritional standpoint because of the variability associated with the product.
It's really much more about the value of the nutrients that are being delivered and not so much the cost per ton of that particular ingredient.
Yeah, it is.
Merrill, we've been talking quite a bit about just the nutrient variation of some of the key nutrients that are very easy to measure, things like protein and fat and maybe the fiber content or NDF content. All of those things, obviously, there's different variation in. But there's another aspect that really goes another layer deeper that can have a huge impact on productivity of the animals as well. And that's things like digestibility of the amino acids, digestibility of different fractions of those nutrients, as well as, especially when we're talking protein, the rumen degradability portion of it. So how much is actually going to be broken down in the rumen to ammonia and how much is actually going to bypass the rumen as bypass protein. Can you comment real quickly on what kind of an impact that could have?
Well, it can have a pretty significant impact, Mike. As we mentioned, first of all, you've got the variability in just the basic nutrients themselves. But within a cow, you have 2 points of digestion that can occur. First area is in the rumen, and as far as protein is concerned, we usually call that rumen degradable. If it can be broken down in the rumen or not broken down in the rumen, and then protein that goes past the rumen can be digested by the cow, just as a normal person or monogastric could break that protein down. And depending on the process and depending on the plant it comes from and variability, again, not only can you have variation in just the basic nutrient value of that product, but you can have variation in the way that product is broken down within a ruminant.
We've been talking a lot about the consistency of nutrients, so that's our consistent nutrient portion of the program that we wanted to talk about. In addition to that, we also want to talk about the influence that nutrients can have on the diet itself. So this, rather than talking as much about consistency, we want to talk just a little bit more about some of the key nutrients that we see within a product like distillers that may actually limit our ability to utilize just a lot of distillers in the diet. So that's kind of what we want to shift into at this point. One of the key things, though, to realize is that distillers really is a good nutrient source for it. It is a great ingredient for dairy diets.
It's a good source of certain amino acids. It has energy in it by fat. It has digestible NDF. Has a number of nutrients that, if used appropriately, dairy cows need to make milk.
There's probably about 3 different nutrients that we focus on when we start talking about some of the limitations, at least in a dairy diet. One of those is unsaturated fat. The second one that we start getting some concern about is the actual amino acid profile, typically looking at digestible lysine as being something that's short in distillers versus what the overall requirements are of the cow. And then a third one, it's probably not really a cow impact, but it's the phosphorus content of the distillers. And it's really more from a nutrient management standpoint that we're concerned there, because we tend to have quite high phosphorus content. Maybe you can comment real quickly on the unsaturated fat side of things.
Yeah, if you look at the one that's probably going to be the most difficult to work around in distillers, especially as we increase the amount of distillers that we may be feeding in our diets in the future, is the unsaturated fat level in distillers. Dairy cows, the rumen environment does not like unsaturated fat. It can have a detrimental effect on rumen fermentation.
So if we really would overload the rumen with total fat and especially unsaturated fat, what kind of effect would that have on digestibility of some of the other nutrients in the diet, things like NDF or the fiber component?
Yeah, usually what happens when you put too much fat in the rumen, especially an unsaturated fat, it tends to decrease fiber digestion in the cow. That tends to alter your rumen microbial population a little bit and causes some problems. It may even lead to milk fat depression in dairy cows.
Especially on the fiber side, we get into that situation where maybe we're trying to increase the energy component of the diet quite a bit by adding fat, which is high in energy, but at the same time, if we impact fiber digestibility and drop that, we may actually be losing energy or at least not be making the gain that we expected to.
Yeah, fiber is an energy source for the cow. So if you add fat to try to increase the energy and you decrease fiber digestion at the same time, you're right, you may not be actually gaining any energy to the cow.
You'd mentioned as well kind of the impact that we can potentially have on things like milk fat composition. We're not talking about acidosis here. Maybe you can give us just a little more background on what kind of cascade of events would kind of lead to a lower milk fat content because of this.
Well, there's been a lot of research lately in milk fat depression. And what they found is that in some cases there's specific fatty acids that when you supply them to a cow create a significant decrease in the butterfat composition of milk. And as you said, it is not a acidosis situation. In some research studies, they've actually supplied these fatty acids right past the rumen, right into the small intestine of the animal. And they found with very small inclusion rates from 2 to 10 grams of this particular type of fatty acid, they can decrease butterfat composition in the milk by up to 40–50%.
And so when we see, potentially a fat content decrease of like, let's say 3.8 down into a 3.1 or a 3.2 situation, it could be a very small amount of this particular fatty acid that's getting to the small intestine, being absorbed and getting to the mammary gland that could have that impact.
That's very true, Mike. Recent research has shown that usually there's a biohydrogenation process that occurs in the rumen. And what that is really taking unsaturated fats, and the rumen microbes make those into saturated fats. And in a normal healthy cow, in a normal healthy rumen, that goes through a very specific process of how that occurs. And sometimes, because of various conditions within the rumen, that process can be disrupted. And the microbes within the rumen will make that. That'll go into the small intestine of the cow and it'll create this butterfat depression. And that does not have to be an acidotic situation, which we always assumed in the past.
Kind of to conclude this discussion a little bit, what are some of the things that we can do to really help us, prevent this opportunity for a milk fat depression because of a CLA type fatty acid getting to the udder of the cow?
Well, the biggest thing is, Mike, is know what the variation of your product is, know what the ingredient composition of your product is, and as your nutritionist is putting your diet together, make sure that they monitor things like NDF content, make sure that they monitor unsaturated fat content, not just total fat in the diet, but unsaturated fat content, so they are aware of what is a safe or an unsafe level for a dairy cow.
We've talked about a lot of different terminology today as we've gone through, things like DDG, things like WDG, different things like that. Maybe you could help us out a little bit with some of the terminology and what these things stand for.
Well, really, those two terms are just talking about the moisture of the product. WDG would be wet distillers grains. DDG would be dried distillers grains. So as we mentioned earlier, the wet product are going to be fed to animals probably closer to the plants that are producing those. And as you get farther away from a freight standpoint, they're going to dry those products down so they can ship them more efficiently. Those are going to be the DDGs, dried distillers grains.
Thank you, Merrill, very much for joining us today.
Thanks, I enjoyed being here.
It's obviously not the easiest topic that we have to talk about, especially when we start looking at something that's really not completely new to the industry. We've used distillers and dairy diets for many, many different years. But really the challenges that we're seeing today are this rapid growth in ethanol production, with over 100 plants being in production today and another 40 or 50 actually being planned. Obviously it's going to create much more demand for corn going into fuel production. And with that creates some challenges within our industry. But anytime that we have challenges, we have opportunities as well. And some of those things are going to be much more likely that we're going to see higher corn prices and higher ingredient prices. But at the same time, we're going to have a lot of byproducts that we're going to have to figure out how to utilize as best we can. Now, some of the challenges that we talked about today are dealing with some of the variation and nutrient consistency that we have within those products. And that's really a place that Cargill Animal Nutrition can help you understand some of the variation, how you can manage that, how you can do the best job that you can on identifying those best sources. From there, if you'd like some additional resources, please feel free to join us and visit our website at www.cargillanimalnutrition.com. We have a lot of great resources there, including one link that mentions See the Difference. From there, you can actually get to a number of different white papers and other resources that would be available to learn more. And that's it for today. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us here on The Cattle Show. I'm Mike Jared for Cargill Animal Nutrition.
If you have a product or service that you'd like to see featured on a future program, or if you have questions or comments, please contact us.